Thanks so much, Orion. It's good to see you. And I also want to thank Luis for organizing this fantastic event. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in it. I just wish we could all get a drink together, especially after hearing Professor Suzuki's discussion of the vital powers of alcohol. I really felt like we should be having a drink after that. But okay, I'll just start. In 1936, Arthur Lovejoy put forward the thesis that the Platonist conception of the great chain of being animates far more of the history of European metaphysics than we're perhaps used to assuming. This Platonist metaphysics undergoes significant revisions, Lovejoy tells us, but it involves three logically connected principles: the principle of plentitude, which states that everything that can be must be; the principle of continuity, which states that there are no gaps in nature. One form of being is always ontologically continuous with the next. And the principle of atemporal unilinear gradation, which states that the continuity connecting the various forms of nature are arranged hierarchically, with the higher grades of nature expressing greater perfection than the lower grades. According to Lovejoy, at the beginning of the 19th century, this understanding of the natural world was transformed into an evolutionary metaphysics that describes the universe as developing greater and greater perfection and gradually more complex forms over time. Significantly, he identifies Schelling as the philosopher who, more than anyone else of the period, temporalizes the great chain of being. With Schelling, the story goes, the graduated sequence of nature's forms is understood as a historical sequence, with one form actually emerging from another in time. Lovejoy rightly points out that this temporalization of the great chain of being is not accomplished in one fell swoop. On the contrary, key metaphysical commitments must be gradually revised before thinkers such as Schelling can explicitly champion a historical account of nature's development towards greater perfection. And in fact, it isn't entirely clear whether Schelling himself ever did fully and unambiguously embrace such a view. Yet the view is there in Schelling, even if it's only, or if it's often, implicit. There's consequently a significant amount of tension within the early 19th century philosophies of nature, Schelling's included, a tension between a more traditional philosophical aim of identifying the strictly rational, atemporal chain of natural forms, and the more radical philosophical aim of uncovering the historical development of natural forms. In what follows, I explore this tension within Schelling's thought as it's found in the 1804 lectures, The System of the Entire Philosophy, and the Philosophy of Nature in particular. As I hope will become apparent, not only does Schelling suggest that there are two distinct ways to conceive the great chain of being, as an atemporal series on the one hand, and as an essentially historical series on the other, but his interest in the latter, the historical series, that further suggests that the philosophy of nature must include an account of multiple chains of being that are realized in the history of nature. And that idea should become clear by the end of my talk. Okay. So first part of the talk, I have two parts. The first part's much longer than the second part. First part, the rational progression of life. I'm going to focus on the philosophy of organic nature in particular today, what Schelling calls nature raised to the third power, or nature in the third potency. The language of power or potency is helpful here because it points to the fact that Schelling's account of organic life is in no way self-contained. He doesn't think that one can understand the essential being of living things if one fails to attend to the way life is a potentiation or higher intensification of inorganic natural processes. So although I'm not focusing on inorganic phenomena here, it's important to keep in mind the fact that for Schelling, the great chain of being is one that involves inorganic forms that are continuous with the organic. So the motion and qualities of unorganized bodies are essential to the structure of nature. And more than this, it's impossible to understand the distinctive character of living things as living without reference to the more basic natural processes that make life possible. Thus, in setting our sights on understanding the nature of life, we're immediately thrown into certain discussions of Schelling's philosophy of inorganic nature as well. We can begin with Schelling's claim that life involves the unification of matter and light being the essential features of the first and second potency, respectively. So the first potency involves the fundamental forces of nature, which constitute material bodies, repulsion, attraction, and gravity. The second potency is identified with light because it involves the qualitative properties of natural objects, properties that cannot be reduced to mere dynamics. This is where we get the universal categories of physics, magnetism, electricity, and the chemical process. And as we'll see, the second potency is going to be especially significant when it comes to the nature of life. So I realize these comments on matter, life, I'm going through this quickly, matter, life, matter, light, life, first, second, third potency, super abstract. I'm just going to push through with this. And if there's something I can clarify or try to clarify in the discussion, I'm happy to do that. Okay, as I mentioned, generally speaking, life, the third potency, involves some kind of unification of first and second potency, or matter and light. Matter is characterized by a form of identity in which what is contracts into oneness. Bodies seek unity with other bodies through their immanent gravitational motion. Light, by contrast, is characterized by an infinite expansion outwards, an intensified form of identity, which affirms what things are in all of their particularity. Right? So things show themselves as the qualitatively specific things they are in the light of day. And living things, as the unity of matter and light, are particular beings that both are what they are and are identical in some sense to all other things. Indeed, the fundamental activities of life allow an organism to maintain itself as the individual organism it is through its relationship to other things with which it is unified, namely inorganic bodies and the other organisms that populate its world. This is how organic selfhood is achieved. Rather than staying at this general level, however, I think it's helpful to get into the specific ways that living things achieve selfhood. This will also allow us to reconstruct Schelling's understanding of the chain of life forms that leads from the least to the most complex. And we can begin with the most basic form of life, plants. According to Schelling, plants are the most basic life form because they express a kind of selfhood that intensifies magnetic phenomena or raises magnetism to a higher power. And magnetism is, for him, the most basic category of physics. I know even at a conference devoted exclusively to the concept of nature and German idealism, this material seems so odd. Like plants are, raise magnetism to a higher power, but there's a logical point to what Schelling is saying. Plants are things of the earth that grow towards the sun. And in this way, they seek to perpetuate themselves, they seek to become selves by unifying matter and light in the most basic way possible, by treating the earth and the sun as two poles of one and the same magnet. From the perspective of the plant, the terrestrial and celestial realms are not fundamentally different from one another. They are two aspects of the same being, two poles of the same magnet, the self that the plant strives to be. Significantly, because the activity of the plant involves the pursuit of unity from the earth to the sun, growth is essential to what plants are. They don't cease growing out of their own accord, but instead they go on endlessly in their reproduction of self. Obviously, plants never make it to the sun, but they would if they could. And that's because the way plants seek the unity between the first and second potency, matter and light, is through reproduction. That is through the nutritive process that allows the living thing to grow. Although it will be a long time before Schelling discovers the richness of Aristotle's thought, there's clearly something Aristotelian in this. As Aristotle argues, while all living things nourish themselves and grow, this isn't unique to plant life. Nourishment and growth are nevertheless essential to the soul of the plant. Schelling's less Aristotelian way of putting this, and here he's drawing upon Herder and Kielmeyer, is to say that self-reproduction is a power of life that is expressed to the highest degree in plants. Plant life, more than any other form of life, is defined by reproduction because there is a preponderance of reproductive activity in plants and a lesser degree of the other two activities of life, which are irritability and sensibility, or as Schelling also puts it in the 1804 lectures, motion and perception. Reproduction is the most basic thing life does. In order for an organism to remain the active being it is, it must reproduce itself. Rationally speaking, then, the most basic form of life is that form of life that reproduces or continues itself, and where that is the main activity of what that thing does. So this isn't a form of life in which difference plays a particularly important role. Whereas the most basic form of life intensifies the power of magnetic polarity in which the earth and sun, negative and positive, are unified in one being, the second major form of life intensifies the power of differentiation characteristic of electricity. Okay, so we're moving from plants to another form of life, and this second form of life, whatever it turns out to be, is somehow connected to difference and electricity as opposed to identity and magnetism. The first thing we can unpack here is what electricity has to do with difference. According to Schelling, the surfaces of material bodies have either a negative or positive electrical charge, and such bodies are related to other bodies, bodies other than themselves, on account of these differences. Within the realm of the organic world, this electricity is expressed as motion, motion through which an organism relates to things that are other than it. So unlike the case of the plant, which grows through self-reproduction and relates to the sun as an aspect of its own fundamental identity, this second form of life moves in a world of objects with which it differs, or from which it differs. In fact, as we'll see later on, the form of life here even differs from itself in certain respects. Now, although all living things express some degree of motion, Schelling has in mind here the world of infusoria, a category of life that during Schelling's time referred to a broad range of microscopic organisms. And infusoria, Schelling says, are, quote, capable of the fastest movement, faster than any other life form. Indeed, these organisms are barely perceptible, not only given their magnitude, but also on account of their speed. So the first two organic activities, reproduction and motion, first two major organic activities, are expressed to the greatest degree in the life of plants and infusoria, respectively. The third essential activity of life is sensibility, which Schelling identifies as the chemical process raised to a higher power. And sensibility, of course, corresponds to the animal kingdom. Animals perceive to a greater extent than any other living thing. So now we have animals, sensibility, and the chemical process. What does sensibility have to do with the chemical process, and how do animals, with their preponderance of sensibility, achieve a unique form of unity between the material identity of all things and the particularity that we get in light, the particularity in which things are what they are? In earlier texts, Schelling actually associates the chemical process with reproduction and sensibility with magnetism, so there's something interesting here about this apparent shift in his perspective. I think Schelling's point about the connection between the chemical process and sensibility is intelligible, however, if we consider the following. In chemical processes, a material body is related throughout its entire being to that which is other than it. In the processes of chemical combination and separation, all of a body's qualities prove to be intrinsically related to the qualities of other bodies. So much so that everything about a body changes as a result of chemical interaction. This is different from the case of electricity, the discharge of which does not alter a body throughout, but only on its surface. So this is why Schelling also, I've left this stuff out, but Schelling also associates electricity and irritability or motion with the second dimension or two-dimensional figures, and he associates chemistry and sensibility with the third dimension or three-dimensionality. Okay. So in chemical phenomena, bodies are related to that which is other than them throughout their being, not only in a superficial manner. Now, what does this have to do with sensibility and animal life? In sensing the world beyond itself, an organism incorporates that which is other than it. It relates to that which is other than it, and it does so in a thoroughgoing manner. The organism isn't in a superficial relationship with the outside world. The inner life of an animal is constituted by perceptions of that which is external. And that's what it means to be an animal, to have a great range of perceptions of other things, things beyond the self, but which, in being perceived, become one's own, become the stuff of one's own experience. This isn't merely chemical. For in a chemical process, a body is fundamentally transformed. Here, in the chemical process raised to a higher power, right, the living body is maintained as the living body it is through its perceptions of the outside world. By sensing the world beyond it, the animal is able to respond to threats. It's able to seek nutrition in plants and other animals. It's able to reproduce with other organisms of its species, and so on. Thus, the maintenance of the living thing and the maintenance of its species is dependent upon sensation, which allows the animal to relate to that which is other than it. That which is other than it as other, and yet still making that otherness its own. Unlike infusoria, then, which are so indeterminate that they lose themselves in sheer difference, and unlike plants, which only seek more of themselves beyond themselves, the plant, recall, doesn't relate to the sun as different, but as one pole of the plant's own being. So unlike infusoria and plants, animals achieve the most complex form of unity with the rest of the natural world through their particularity. They perceive the things around them as other, and yet maintain their own selves precisely in this unity with what is different. Okay, so that's the main series of life forms that Schelling considers in this system, with each of the three forms being defined by a preponderance of one of the three basic activities of life: reproduction, irritability, and sensibility. There is, importantly, one further form of life that Schelling discusses, the highest form of life, in fact, and that's the human organism. The human, Schelling argues, expresses the absolute identity of plant and animal life, the two forms of non-human life that are most different from one another. As Schelling puts it, the human organism is, quote, torn from the earth like the animal and erect like the plant, right? Capable of motion and perception, while also being elevated above the animal desire for earthly things. Consequently, the human organism is capable of contemplating the nature of the entire universe and its essential structure. It is the culmination of nature's development and the transition to the ideal world, the world in which the potencies of matter, light, and life are recapitulated as cognition, action, and art. Schelling's account of life in the 1804 system is in many ways of a piece with what he says elsewhere about the organic world. Throughout all of his essays, sketches, outlines, and lectures on the philosophy of nature, Schelling seeks to understand the rational structure of the natural world, a structure that is not imposed on nature by our minds, but a structure that is intrinsic to nature itself. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that much of this is consistent with a traditional philosophical account of life. There's certainly an aspect of Schelling's view that's heterodox. The higher forms of life here are understood on the basis of the lower forms, since the higher forms depend in some sense upon the lower. Indeed, even spirit itself, the whole ideal world, has its basis in nature. As many commentators have said before, Schelling's philosophy of nature turns the Neoplatonist procession of the one on its head, so that everything moves from the bottom up, from matter to light to life, and ultimately to spirit. As Schelling himself puts it in the 1803 edition of the Ideas, quote, "Matter is the general seed of the universe in which is hidden everything that unfolds in the later developments." So I don't mean to downplay the significance of this. I think this is one of the things that makes idealist philosophy of nature so compelling, not just historically interesting, but deeply relevant to our contemporary understanding of the world and our place within it. Yet, there is nevertheless something traditional about Schelling's account of life here. And while there's nothing necessarily wrong with the traditional account of life, I think it's important to note that much of what goes on in Schelling's philosophy of nature is consistent with a classical understanding of the natural world, despite the fact that Schelling inverts the classical picture so that we begin with sheer matter and its potentiation or elevation to more fully rational forms of expression. Why do I say that Schelling is pursuing a relatively classical project here? Because not only does Schelling employ the principles of plentitude and continuity to explain the diversity of life forms, but significantly, he is describing the structure of life as it develops in one direction and in an atemporal fashion. Plants do not evolve into infusoria in time. And infusoria, at least from the perspective we've considered so far, infusoria do not evolve into animals. Everything that happens in the development from one stage of life to another happens only from an atemporal perspective, just as, according to the classical Neoplatonic model, the procession of the one is atemporal. So what we find here, and this is what we find throughout all of Schelling's texts on the philosophy of nature up to the ages of the world, what we find here is an inversion of the classical great chain of being, but an inversion of the great chain of being that retains its unidirectional and atemporal character. Lovejoy had remarked that Schelling temporalizes the chain of being, but there's nothing of the sort here. At least we haven't seen anything like that yet. And okay, so this is the second part of the paper. It's much, much shorter than the first part. This is 3 pages long. Okay. Although Schelling's explicit account of life in the 1804 system concerns the unidirectional and atemporal series of life forms, the chain of being that leads from plants to infusoria to animals, Schelling also suggests that there's a second way to think about the variety of life forms. And this second way to think about life hints at the possibility that the forms of life necessarily emerge in time and through a process that is not unidirectional. To get this very different way of thinking into view, it will be helpful to look more closely at Schelling's discussion of infusoria. Schelling describes infusoria as the midpoint of the plant and animal kingdoms. And from what we've already seen, this makes sense. Just as electricity is the midpoint between magnetism and the chemical process, infusoria is the second moment in a 3-part series. The world of infusoria is in between the most basic form of life, plants, and the more advanced form of life, animals. But when we put it that way, when we describe infusoria and their motion as somehow going beyond mere plant life, something seems off. Isn't it odd to say that plants are more basic than microscopic organisms? Are plants really so basic that, right? Isn't there a sense in which single-celled organisms are even more basic as a form of life? Well, yes, and Schelling thinks so too. And if we concentrate on this fact, we can see a second and very different sense in which Schelling identifies the world of infusoria as the middle point between plant and animal life. According to Schelling, infusoria are not only barely perceptible because of their magnitude or because of the speed of their activity, they are essentially indeterminate, with boundaries that aren't only difficult for us to perceive, but which are intrinsically lacking in definition. Infusoria are not fully organized, and lacking complete organization, they're not entirely actual instances of life. Indeed, one could argue that infusoria are not, strictly speaking, organisms. And yet Schelling says this form of life, as the indeterminate midway point between plant and animal life, is rationally necessary for a reason we have not yet considered. According to Schelling, there must be a midway point between plant and animal life, because if this weren't the case, if there weren't some indeterminate form of life such as infusoria, then the graduated sequence of natural forms would appear as follows. The, quote, most developed plants would have to join up with the lowest animal genera. That is, the most complicated plant species would be most similar to the most basic animal species. But Schelling says that just isn't the case. On the contrary, the most developed forms of plant life are furthest from animal life. They're nothing alike. The situation is very different, right? While the more basic forms of plant life and the more basic forms of animal life are more similar, the more fully plant-like plants and the more fully animal-like animals are least similar. They're furthest apart. Now, it may not seem obvious at first, but this is a big deal. It means that we can't think of the chain of nature in the classical way, plants, animals, humans, as one continuous unidirectional series. What we have instead are two series, a plant series and an animal series, two series which can appear continuous only at their most basic stages. And this means there must be some other form of life, a form of life at the ground of the plant and animal series, a form of life that is far less determinate, far more simple than any plant or animal organism. Infusoria must necessarily exist, Schelling argues, because there must be some form of life from which the progressive series of plant forms and the progressive series of animal forms issues. As Schelling puts it, the plant and animal kingdoms must have their origin in the indeterminate world of infusoria. This is why there must be a middle point between the plant and animal kingdoms. There must be a living source of the two kingdoms of life. Infusoria are neither plant nor animal, but instead make both possible as the primordial identity of plant and animal life and the living basis of organic differentiation. The world of infusoria, therefore, is the point of indifference from which all life forms emerge. This way of thinking about the rational connections between natural forms is importantly different from the progressive series that runs from plants to infusoria to animals. Not only does the world of infusoria occupy the first rung on this ladder, but the chain of life itself is multiple, involving a bifurcation of life forms out of infusoria. There's actually something proto-Bergsonian about the idea that life develops according to a logic of divergence. Moreover, there's a suggestion in all of this that forms of life actually emerge in time. I'm not arguing here that in the system of the entire philosophy, Schelling is explicitly providing an account of the historical generation of plant and animal life. That's not what he's doing in the Würzburg lectures, nor is it what he's doing in the texts on the philosophy of nature that lead up to those lectures. And yet, Schelling is not, although Schelling is not explicitly giving an account of life's historical development, he is hitting upon the philosophical significance of such natural historical development. And if Schelling is right in that, if he's right to be alive to the philosophical significance of nature's history, then this has interesting metaphysical implications, specifically when it comes to the metaphysics of the great chain of being. Without sacrificing the principles of plentitude and continuity, and without sacrificing the hierarchical character of the great chain of being. So Schelling continues to understand the human organism as the end or goal of a natural development, and rightly so in my view. Without sacrificing these aspects of the traditional conception of the great chain of being, Schelling paves the way for a philosophy of nature in which life is understood to develop along different lines of evolution and to develop necessarily in time, as if there could not be natural forms or essential structures in nature without the work of time. This final paragraph. As I see it, the account of life we find in the system of 1804 is representative of Schelling's general philosophical orientation prior to the groundbreaking ages of the world, in which the rational development of natural and spiritual forms is understood to be essentially historical and yet still rational, importantly, unlike the late Schelling. From the first edition of On the World Soul to the Freedom Essay and the Stuttgart Lectures, we find a tension within Schelling's thought between an explicit commitment to presenting the atemporal rational structure of nature and an interest in the actual historical emergence of geological and organic forms. As I see it, the importance of this tension within Schelling's thought goes beyond scholarship on the history of idealism, and strange as it may sound, really does concern our contemporary situation in philosophy. It seems to me that in our intellectual milieu, academic and non-academic, we have effectively lost sight of the possibility that nature is rationally structured, that some forms of life are more perfect than others, and that the gradual evolution of natural forms provides us with support rather than skepticism for the view that the human being is the greatest of creatures and the site of all that is divine. Schelling's philosophy of nature sheds light on these possibilities and helps us to imagine in our post-Darwinian age what it might mean to once again contemplate the plentitude, continuity, and hierarchy in nature. Thank you.